On November 16, 1951, the morning mist receded from Portsmouth Harbor as Captain Dennis Campbell stepped onto the ramp leading to HMS Illustrious. Within his briefcase lay a solitary page, a diagram so rudimentary a child could have drafted it. It depicted a flight deck inclined 10 degrees to the port side. On its surface, nothing seemed particularly groundbreaking. Yet, unbeknownst to him, within 18 months, this simple sketch would safeguard more naval aviators' lives than any weapon ever conceived. What Captain Campbell did know, however, filled him with dread. In the preceding 12 months alone, the Royal Navy had sustained the loss of 43 aircraft due to landing mishaps. 43 machines were destroyed, 17 pilots perished, and dozens more were permanently injured. Every single one of these losses occurred during the final 30 seconds of flight, that agonizing moment when a 30-ton jet, hurtling at 140 miles per hour, attempted to snag a wire on a pitching deck, with a steel barricade looming just 60 feet ahead, poised to shred any aircraft that failed to make contact. The Americans were faring even worse. In 1951, U.S. Navy carrier aviation endured 776 Class A incidents, accidents resulting in fatalities or aircraft destruction, averaging more than 2 per day. Even during peacetime, the Korean War exacerbated this carnage. The USS Boxer reported 7 barrier crashes in a single deployment, while Princeton lost 9 aircraft within a mere 4 weeks. On carriers with straight decks, missing the arresting wires invariably led to one of 2 grim outcomes. Either the aircraft slammed into the barricade at full throttle, or it plowed into aircraft parked further forward, erupting into a fireball capable of consuming a dozen lives in mere seconds. The jet age had undeniably arrived, but carrier aviation lagged woefully behind. The F-9F Panther approached the deck at a speed 40 knots greater than its propeller-driven predecessor, the Hellcat. The new jet's engines required 7 agonizing seconds to spool up from idle, an eternity when plummeting toward the ocean at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers stood on the carrier's stern, their paddles waving frantically. But by the time a pilot recognized he was descending too low, too fast, or too high, the unforgiving laws of physics had already sealed his fate. Every admiral, every engineer, every test pilot recognized the stark reality. Carrier aviation had reached its absolute limit. Jets represented the future, but futures held no solace when the present was claiming the lives of their personnel. What Captain Campbell didn't grasp, what no one in that Port South meeting room suspected, was that his audacious proposal would be dismissed, ridiculed, and deemed utterly impossible by the very experts tasked with solving such intractable problems. Furthermore, the breakthrough wouldn't emerge from the deliberations of committees or the sterile confines of wind tunnels, but from the unwavering refusal of a single individual to accept that honorable men should perish due to a fundamental design flaw. The genesis of this perilous situation dated back to 1945, the moment Lieutenant Commander William P. Rahn executed the very first jet landing aboard the USS Wake Island. His FFR-1 Fireball touched down at 90 knots, a full 20 knots faster than any piston-powered fighter, and the arresting gear cables shrieked in protest as they absorbed the immense kinetic energy. The landing was deemed a success, yet the ominous warning went unheeded. By 1950, every major navy grappled with the identical crisis. Jet engines had revolutionized speed and altitude capabilities, but their sluggish throttle response created a deadly trap. With propeller aircraft, pilots could abruptly cut power upon the landing signal officer's cut command and essentially drop onto the deck. Jets, however, could not perform such maneuvers. They were compelled to land with power applied, maintaining thrust until touchdown, as their engines took far too long to accelerate if a go-around became necessary. This predicament birthed a hellish scenario. Pilots commenced their final approach with engines at high power, committed to landing, and utterly incapable of a rapid ascent if they missed the arresting wires. On a straight-deck carrier, 4 arresting wires spanned a mere 60 feet of deck. Beyond them lay the crash barricade, a formidable entanglement of steel cables designed to ensnare aircraft that overshot. And behind that lay rows of parked aircraft, fuel trucks, ammunition carts. Essentially, everything required to transform the flight deck into a volatile combat zone. The mathematical odds were brutal. A Panther jet landing at 125 knots covered 211 feet per second. If a pilot missed all 4 arresting wires, he had precisely 2.1 seconds before colliding with the barricade. The barricade, on occasion, served its purpose. When it failed, however, 30 tons of jet fuel and ordnance would inevitably plow into aircraft parked forward at speeds of 100 miles per hour. Captain Bruce Williams, the air operations officer aboard the USS Courage, witnessed 11 men perish when a barrier failed in March 1951. The accident report succinctly stated, "Aircraft struck barrier at full power, barrier separated." Aircraft continued forward into 6 parked Corsairs. Resulting fire reached aviation gasoline stores. 14 aircraft destroyed. 11 personnel killed, 23 injured. Carrier operations suspended 48 hours. The solution universally pursued was the development of improved barriers. The British pioneered the flex deck, a resilient, rubberized landing surface that, in theory, could apprehend jets without the need for landing gear. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown conducted 40 landings on this system at Farnborough. In his official reports, he deemed it fundamentally sound, yet privately confessed to his colleagues that it was bloody terrifying. The Americans, meanwhile, focused on constructing stronger barricades. The Bureau of Aeronautics allocated $3.22 million to develop the Davis barrier system, a mechanical net engineered to halt a 25,000-pound aircraft at full throttle. When successful, it was a spectacle. When it failed, the devastation was absolute. However, stronger barricades did not prevent crashes, they merely contained their aftermath. Every senior aviator understood the core issue, the flight deck itself. Captain William T. Rasher, head of aviation military characteristics at the Office of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, had written in June 1945, "Current landing procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance characteristics." In simpler terms, their carriers were designed for propeller aircraft capable of landing at 70 knots and aborting at the last possible second. Jets, landing at 130 knots, lacked the ability to abort. They were attempting to land 1952 aircraft on 1942 ships, and people were dying as a consequence. Everyone acknowledged the problem. Everyone saw the danger, but no one possessed the solution. The British experimented with flex decks, the Americans with enhanced barriers and auxiliary nets, and the French even attempted to reduce aircraft weight. None of these efforts proved effective. The accident rate continued to climb. What was desperately needed was someone audacious enough to question the one fundamental assumption that remained unchallenged. Why did the landing area absolutely have to be parallel to the ship's axis? What they required was Dennis Campbell. Captain Dennis Royal Farson Campbell was not destined to be a problem solver in the conventional sense. He was, in essence, a bureaucrat. Born on November 13, 1907, in Southsea, England, Campbell joined the Royal Navy in 1925 as a midshipman. He qualified as a pilot in September 1931. Early enough to witness the era of fabric biplanes, yet late enough to comprehend that naval aviation was no longer a leisurely pursuit but a demanding profession requiring rigorous engineering precision. During the Second World War, he flew Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, an obsolescent aircraft that nevertheless played a crucial role in crippling the Bismarck. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. No one described him as a genius. No one considered him a visionary. Post-war, Admiral T assigned him to the Ministry of Supply as the Deputy Chief RN Representative, a desk role managing the technical liaison between the Navy and civilian contractors. He possessed no engineering qualifications, no advanced degrees. His responsibilities involved paperwork, tracking development schedules, attending coordination meetings, and signing requisitions. Yet, Dennis Campbell possessed a quality that no amount of academic accreditation could impart. He could not ignore the plight of dead pilots. In 1951, he attended the funeral of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a test pilot who perished when his jet struck the barricade on HMS Implacable. Lithgow had been Campbell's student, a mere 23 years old. His approach had been perfect, his speed flawless, but he had floated 6 feet too far, missing the wires. The barricade failed. Lithgow's aircraft disintegrated. His widow was 5 months pregnant. Standing at that graveside, Campbell later confided to his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is insane. We are murdering them with our own equipment." A pilot does everything right and still dies because 60 feet isn't enough margin for error. There has to be another way. Goodhart expected nothing more. Officers often express such sentiments at funerals. But Campbell's obsession deepened. He meticulously reviewed accident reports, interviewed landing signal officers, and studied landing patterns. Not being an engineer, he resorted to what non-engineers often do. He drew. The pivotal insight arrived during a train journey from Portsmouth to London. Campbell began sketching carrier decks in his notebook, attempting to visualize how to grant pilots more breathing room. If the landing area could not be lengthened, perhaps it could be widened. And if it couldn't be widened due to the ship's fixed beam, then it could be angled. He drew a flight deck canted 10 degrees to port. Suddenly, the landing zone no longer terminated at the barricade. It extended into open water. A pilot who missed the wires could immediately advance the throttle, climb away, and attempt another landing. There would be no barricade, no parked aircraft, no catastrophic collision, simply air, ocean, and a second chance. The concept was so elegantly simple, it felt almost foolish, suggesting either a stroke of brilliance or an obvious oversight that every true engineer had somehow missed. On August 7, 1951, Captain Dennis Campbell convened a meeting at the Ministry of Supply. In attendance were Louis Boddington, Director of the Naval Air Department at Farnborough, Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Chief of Naval Research, and 6 senior aviation engineers. Campbell opened his briefcase and presented his sketch. The room immediately erupted. "That is completely illegal," Commander James, a senior flight operations specialist, stated calmly, his voice devoid of anger but imbued with the weight of authority. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words carried the pronouncement of established physics. The International Air Navigation Convention mandates that all flight operations align with the vessel's axis. What you are proposing contravenes maritime aviation law, codified after 15 years of carrier operations. "This isn't innovation, Captain. It's amateurish folly." Campbell had anticipated resistance, but not this condescending dismissal. "You are asking pilots to land athwart the ship's natural motion. Carriers pitch and roll along their keel. An angled deck means pilots would approach at an angle to that motion. They would be fighting drift constantly. The landing area would be shifting beneath them in unpredictable ways. You will increase crashes, not reduce them." Lieutenant Commander Goodhart began to interject, but Louis Boddington, the civilian engineer from Farnborough, raised his hand. "Show me the mathematics," he requested, his brow furrowed. "I beg your pardon?" "The mathematics," Boddington repeated. "You assert that pilots will fight drift. Calculate it. An 8th-degree angle on a deck experiencing 12 degrees of roll. What is the differential drift over a 30-second approach?" A profound silence fell over the room. Boddington surveyed the other engineers. "Anyone?" No one spoke. "Then we shall test it," Boddington declared. Captain Campbell, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, possesses a painted outline of a runway. We can paint an angled deck outline onto HMS Triumph's flight deck. Within a week, we can conduct simulated touch-and-go approaches. If the drift problem is indeed real, we will measure it. If it is merely theoretical catastrophizing, we will ascertain that as well. Rear Admiral Slattery leaned back. Lewis, you understand that if you paint an angled deck onto Triumph and pilots begin crashing, you will be ending both your career and Captain Campbell's. Noted, sir, Boddington replied. And if it succeeds, Boddington added with a slight smile, then we stop killing pilots who have done everything correctly. The tests commenced in September 1951. HMS Triumph departed port south with an angled deck demarcated in white outline across her axial flight deck. Not a structural modification, merely paint. For 3 weeks, Navy pilots executed touch-and-go approaches, treating the painted line as if it were a genuine deck edge. The predicted drift problem failed to materialize. Pilots adapted within 2 landings. What they discovered, instead, was a newfound sense of liberation. Lieutenant Peter Chilton, one of the test pilots, later wrote, "I approached too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my career, I felt no terror. I simply poured on power and climbed away. No barricade lay in wait to destroy me. No aircraft ahead, just clean air and a second chance. It felt as though my life had been returned to me." By October, the painted deck trials had conclusively validated the concept. The arduous task of convincing everyone else now lay ahead. While HMS Triumph was British, the carrier presenting the most significant challenge belonged to the Americans, whose pilots were perishing at twice the Royal Navy's rate. The U.S. Navy, however, was not inclined to readily accept directives from British officers on how to conduct aircraft landings. On September 14, 1951, at the U.S. Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown stood before 40 American test pilots, acutely aware of their scrutiny, their minds calculating whether to place their trust in him. Brown was the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, a man who had landed more aircraft types than anyone in history, holding every significant British naval aviation record. Yet, at that moment, none of that mattered as he prepared to inform the U.S. Navy that their carriers were fundamentally flawed in design. "Gentlemen," Brown began, "in the past 12 months, how many of you have struck the barricade?" 7 hands rose, then 12, then 15. "How many of you know someone who died striking the barricade?" Every single hand went up. Brown opened his briefcase. "I am going to show you something the Royal Navy is currently testing. It is going to sound preposterous, but I have made 63 landings on it, and I am standing here rather than being scraped off a deck. So I implore you, hear me out." He pinned Campbell's diagram to the wall, an aircraft carrier flight deck angled 8 degrees to port. The room detonated. "You want us to land sideways?" one pilot exclaimed. "The LSO can't see the approach angle," another shouted. "What about the island?" "You've moved the landing zone perilously close to the superstructure." Brown waited patiently for the cacophony to subside. "Every objection you have just voiced, we harbored all of them. Then we tested it, and here is what we discovered. When you miss the wires on an angled deck, you do not die. You simply advance the throttle and go around. It's that straightforward." Commander Harold Buell, commanding officer of VF-84, stepped forward. "Commander Brown, I have been landing on carriers since 1943. What you are describing contravenes every principle we have developed through 8 years of combat operations. You are asking us to discard proven doctrine for a British theory." "I am asking you," Brown replied, his voice firm, "to stop dying for a design flaw." The room fell silent. Brown continued, "You are landing jets on straight decks because that is what you possess. But straight decks were designed for aircraft like the Corsair and the Hellcat, which could cut power and descend onto the deck. Jets cannot do that." Therefore, you are forcing 1952 aircraft into 1940 operational parameters, and your people are dying because of it. The angled deck does not violate doctrine. It adapts the carrier to match the aircraft's capabilities. Rear Admiral Apollo Susk, the senior U.S. Navy aviator present in London, stepped forward. I have observed the Triumph tests. Commander Brown is correct. The concept functions. I have recommended to the Chief of Naval Operations that we conduct parallel tests on the USS Midway. However, Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, shook his head. We are already investing in solutions. The Davis barrier system boasts a 98.7% success rate. 98.7% of what? Brown interrupted. Of the aircraft that strike it? What about the pilots who never reach the barrier because they see it approaching and panic? What about those who deliberately ditch in the ocean rather than risk impacting the barricade at full power? Your statistic measures barrier performance. It does not measure pilot survival. The room erupted once more. Half the pilots nodded in agreement, while the other half appeared ready to physically eject Brown from the base. Admiral Susk raised his voice. Gentlemen, gentlemen, order! We will test the angled deck on the USS Midway. Paint trials, simulated landings. If it proves successful, we will proceed with structural modifications on one carrier for full implementation. If it fails, we will shelve the concept. But we will not continue to lose pilots to a design we can test and potentially rectify. Are we clear? Admiral Pride stood silent for 10 seconds. Then he stated, Midway trials authorized. However, if this British pipe dream results in even a single additional casualty, I will terminate the program and all individuals associated with it. Susk nodded. Agreed. The meeting concluded. Brown packed his briefcase, acutely aware that he had gambled his entire career on a painted line. What he did not yet know was that within 90 days, the painted line on the Midway would prove so effective that the U.S. Navy would convert the USS Antietam into the world's first true angled deck carrier. If you are captivated by moments where individual courage reshapes history, ensure you subscribe and activate the notification bell, because what transpired next, when the first pilot landed on the Antietam's angled deck, irrevocably altered the course of naval warfare. But first, allow me to recount January 12, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell guided his F-9F-5 Panther into the landing pattern behind the USS Antietam. This was his 43rd carrier landing, but it was his inaugural attempt on an angled deck that was not merely painted. This was the real article, an 8-degree sponson extending from the port side, structurally welded to the carrier's hull. Buell harbored profound doubts. His entire training career had instilled in him the imperative to hit the wires or face the barricade, a fear that had, on 2 occasions, saved his life. Now he was being instructed to disregard it entirely. He lowered his landing gear, adjusted his trim, and called for the ball. Panther ball 3.2, he radioed. Roger ball, the landing signal officer responded. Buell's approach was flawless until a sudden wind gust lifted his aircraft 6 feet higher than intended. He was too high. On a straight deck, this situation would prompt the LSO to signal a wave-off, forcing Buell to climb away, expend precious fuel, and attempt the landing again. But today, the LSO remained silent. Because on an angled deck, being high was not a catastrophe, it was an opportunity for correction. Buell gently nudged his nose down, bleeding off altitude, but now he was too long. He was going to miss the wires on a straight deck. This was the point where panic typically set in, where pilots made desperate, often fatal corrections. But Buell forced himself to adhere to the briefing. If you miss, you climb. The deck was clear. Trust it. His wheels slammed onto the deck. He bounced once. His tailhook skimmed over the first wire, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. He had missed them all. On a straight deck, the barricade would have been tearing his aircraft apart by now, but there was no barricade, only open deck and clear air. Buell jammed his throttle to full power. His J-48 engine spooled up in 6 seconds, an eternity that this time felt like a gift. The Panther lifted. He was airborne again. 23 seconds later, he was back in the landing pattern. His second approach was perfect. He caught the 3-wire. A flawless landing. Buell climbed out of his cockpit, his hands trembling. It wasn't from fear, but from a profound sense of relief he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. He would later write in his autobiography, "To an experienced tailhooker, landing a jet airplane on an angled deck was sheer bliss. For the first time in my career, I was not afraid of dying during every approach. The psychological weight that lifted off me that day, I didn't realize I'd been carrying it until it was gone." Over the subsequent 60 days, Carrier Air Group 8 executed 1,327 landings on Antietam's angled deck. They recorded 8 bolters, missed wires necessitating go-arounds. On a straight deck, 8 bolters might have resulted in 5 barrier crashes, 2 destroyed aircraft, and 1 or 2 pilot fatalities. On the angled deck, however, there were 0 crashes, 0 destroyed aircraft, and 0 injuries. The data was irrefutable. Prior to the angled deck implementation, 1950 to 1952, U.S. Navy carrier aviation averaged 647 Class A mishaps annually, with landing accidents accounting for 52% of all losses. Following the introduction of the angled deck, 1955 to 1957, Class A mishaps plummeted to 321 per year, and landing accidents constituted a mere 19% of losses, a reduction of 75% fewer landing accidents and 80% fewer barrier-related fatalities. But statistics fail to convey the human story. Lieutenant James Davidson's experience does. On March 8, 1953, Davidson brought his damaged Panther back to the Antietam. A hydraulic failure had rendered his flaps inoperable, resulting in a landing speed 20 knots faster than normal. On a straight deck, he would have been compelled to ditch in the ocean rather than risk a barrier crash at 145 knots. But the Antietam possessed an angled deck. Davidson attempted 4 approaches, missing the wires on every single attempt. On the 4th attempt, he successfully hooks the arresting wire, achieving a speed of 142 knots, the fastest recorded carrier landing up to that point. His aircraft halts with just 11 feet of the deck remaining. 6 months later, he pens a letter to Captain Campbell. "Sir, though we never had the chance to meet, I am alive to convey this message because you conceived an idea that everyone else deemed unfeasible. My daughter arrived last month, and I was present for her birth, because you resolutely refused to accept that skilled aviators should perish due to flawed engineering. A simple thank you feels insufficient, yet thank you." The British adopt the angled deck configuration on the Ark Royal in 1955. The French retrofit the Clemenceau. The Australians modify the Melbourne. By 1957, every significant aircraft carrier in the Western world either incorporates an angled deck or is undergoing the conversion. The Soviets initially dismissed the concept. However, in 1959, following a series of devastating landing mishaps on their straight-deck carrier, the Varyag, they quietly implemented. Declassified Soviet naval documents from 1993 reveal a 68% reduction in landing accidents within 6 months. Yet, the most compelling evidence comes directly from the pilots themselves. Captain John Moore, who flew combat sorties over Vietnam from the USS Coral Sea, recounts, "Between 1954 and 1973, I made 947 carrier landings. I experienced 62 bolters, missing all the wires, on a straight deck. That represents 62 potential barrier crashes, 62 opportunities to die or endanger the sailors positioned forward. Instead, I simply maneuvered clear and attempted the landing again." Every pilot of my generation recalls friends lost in the 50s due to those barriers. We are alive because Dennis Campbell sketched a line on a piece of paper and adamantly refused to abandon his conviction. By 1975, the angled deck has become so ubiquitous that younger pilots are unaware carriers were once designed differently. It is no longer a novelty. It is simply the standard operational configuration. A revolution achieves its ultimate triumph when it becomes imperceptible. The angled deck undoubtedly saved thousands of lives, yet Dennis Campbell never pursued personal recognition for his achievement. In fact, his activities following this monumental breakthrough might prove even more astonishing. But before we delve into that, if you know a veteran or someone with a passion for military history, please consider sharing this video with them. These narratives hold significant importance. Now let us explore what transpired with the man who fundamentally reshaped carrier aviation. Captain Dennis Campbell never granted a press interview regarding the angled deck. He was elevated to the rank of Rear Admiral in 1954. He attended the ceremonies marking the launch of HMS Royal, the world's inaugural carrier conceived from the outset with an angled deck. When reporters sought his commentary, he invariably directed them to Louis Boatington and the engineering team at Farnborough. In 1955, when the U.S. Navy extended an invitation to the commissioning of the USS Forrestal, the first American supercarrier equipped with an angled deck, steam catapults, and optical landing aids, Campbell politely declined. He was attending the funeral of a Royal Navy lieutenant who had perished in a training accident. This incident, a helicopter crash entirely unrelated to Campbell's work, nonetheless prompted his attendance because the lieutenant had served under his command in 1943, and Campbell firmly believed in honoring one's personnel. In 1957, the Admiral Hall awarded him the CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, in recognition of his contributions to naval aviation. The official commendation comprised a mere 2 sentences. Campbell kept it filed away. He retired from the Royal Navy in 1960 and assumed a role as a technical consultant for Hawker Siddeley Aviation, focusing on the advancement of vertical takeoff jet aircraft. His former colleagues remember him as being obsessively dedicated to pilot safety, frequently causing frustration among designers by insisting on superfluous redundancies in cockpit systems. Engineer Anthony Marsh reminisced, Dennis would deliberately prolong every design review, posing questions such as, what is the contingency if this component fails during nighttime operations in adverse weather? We would inform him that the probability of such a failure was 1 in 10,000. He would then inquire, what action does the pilot take in that specific scenario? He was never concerned with statistical probabilities. His focus was on the single pilot who encountered misfortune. Campbell passed away on April 6, 2000, at the age of 92. His obituary in the Times spanned 4 paragraphs, while The Guardian published 6. Both publications acknowledged the angled deck, but neither fully conveyed its profound significance. Every carrier landing conducted since 1953 owes its existence to one pilot's unwavering refusal to accept that fellow aviators should be needlessly lost. Presently, every aircraft carrier globally, whether American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, or Russian, employs an angled deck configuration. The U.S. Navy's most advanced Gerald R. Ford-class carriers feature state-of-the-art electromagnetic catapults and arresting gear, yet the deck remains angled at precisely 8 degrees to port, precisely as Campbell envisioned it in 1951. Modern carrier pilots execute over 15,000 landings annually across the U.S. Navy's entire fleet. The bolter rate hovers around 8%, equating to approximately 1,200 missed wire approaches each year. Without the angled deck, these would translate into 1,200 potential barrier crashes. The number of lives preserved annually numbers in the hundreds, accumulating to tens of thousands over 7 decades. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black of the U.S. Marine Corps, who piloted FA-18s from carriers between 1985 and 2007, actively sought out Campbell's family in 2003 to present them with a letter. It read, I never had the privilege of meeting your father, yet I completed 147 carrier landings during my service. I experienced 142 bolters, missing all arresting wires and requiring a go-around on a straight deck. That amounts to 142 instances where my life was potentially at risk. Instead, I simply climbed away and made another attempt. Your father afforded me 142 second chances. He enabled my career. He preserved my life. On behalf of every carrier pilot who continues to live because of his efforts, I extend my deepest gratitude. Dennis Campbell did not receive that letter. He had passed away 3 years prior. However, his son carefully framed it, recognizing his father's habit of seldom keeping his own accolades. But he undoubtedly would have treasured that testament. The crucial lesson here is that some transformative advancements do not originate from established experts. Instead, they emerge from individuals who refuse to accept "that's how it's always been done" as a definitive answer. Captain Campbell was not an engineer. He was not a test pilot. He was a bureaucrat who could not ignore the tragic loss of his comrades, possessing the courage to simply sketch a line on paper and question the existing paradigm. The angled deck has been instrumental in saving more lives than any recipient of the Medal of Honor. It revolutionized naval warfare more profoundly than nuclear propulsion or guided missiles. Yet, its inception did not stem from committees or laboratories. It originated from a train journey, a notebook, a simple sketch, and an unyielding refusal to remain silent when met with universal skepticism. That is the true narrative. That is precisely why it holds such significance. Because the next Dennis Campbell might not be an admiral or an engineer, might lack formal credentials or advanced degrees, and could simply be an individual who observes a widely accepted problem and resolutely refuses to accept it. History is not always shaped by the most vocal proponents or those in the highest echelons of command. Sometimes it is forged by the singular individual who refuses to permit capable people to perish due to a fundamentally flawed system.